West Texas, April 1867. Jett Gallatin expected trouble in Alsop, Texas, but not zombies. As the evening breeze blew dust and tumbleweed across the town's main and only street, a gleaming black stallion picked his way along it. The stallion seemed to be the one choosing his own path. His rider sat motionless in the saddle, reins loose, hat pulled down too low for anyone to get a good look at whatever it concealed. There wasn't much to the town yet, just a street with a livery stable at one end and a church at the other. But last year money on 4 hooves had come to Alsop. The railroad had reached Abilene, Kansas, and a beeve worth $5 in Texas was worth $40 if you could get him to the railhead in Abilene. Alsop had reaped the reward of being one of the towns near the head of Jesse Chisholm's trail. The town's new prosperity could be seen by the fact there were more horses in front of the saloon than there were places to hitch them. Prosperity draws folks like flowers draw bees. Did it draw Philip? Mother Mary, please let it have, Jett Gallatin thought. The stallion's rider would never be mistaken for an ordinary cowhand. Jett wore silver-studded black, from the silver-heeled boots and Spanish spurs to the silver-studded hatband on the wide-crowned black hat. This wasn't an outfit made for punching cows, nor was the well-worn custom gun belt with its matched pair of ivory-handled Colts. Everything about the meticulous arrangement of both revolvers told the tale of someone who lived and died by the gun. The holsters tied down, the gun belt tightened so it rode high, comfort sacrificed for the sake of a split-second's advantage in a gunfight. The sleek black stallion was no cow pony either, and his silver-studded carved black leather saddle and tack weren't the sort of thing a working cowhand could afford. Everything about Jett Gallatin told the world the black-clad drifter was either a gambler or a shootist, or both, but no one in their wildest dreams would think Jett Gallatin was a girl. For her freedom, for her life, and for her brother, she played the kind of young gun a boy would want to be and a girl would yearn after. And you all go on thinking I'm a boy. Thanks, Jett said silently. That's what you're supposed to do. For an instant she let herself remember those golden peaceful days when passing as a boy had been only a game she'd shared with her twin brother. You can't just dress like me. You have to be me. Give a pretty girl the eye. Otherwise you'll never fool anybody, he'd told her over and over. Jasper told her. Jasper and Jett Stewart, twin brothers who went places and did things Philip and Philippa Sheridan's parents would never have approved of. Now Jasper was gone, and Jett Gallatin searched for him. And Philippa Sheridan of Court Oaks Plantation in Orleans Parish was someone she used to be, a lifetime ago. She'd named herself Gallatin for Gallatin Street in New Orleans, where she and Mama had gone to hide the night Court Oaks burned. Even now, sometimes she couldn't sleep at night, remembering her home burning. Finally, the stallion stopped next to the rail in front of the saloon. A rancher or a homesteader would have headed for the general store for the local news, but a cowhand would make for the saloon for beer and whiskey, a good meal and better company. A gambler or a drifter would choose the same destination, and so she hoped that's what Philip would do. If there's any trace of him here, this is where I'll find it. She swung her leg over the saddle pommel and dropped gracefully to the ground. Oh, Philip, if you hadn't taught me to play the boy so well, I'd be dead now. She was just 17. She should have been getting ready for one of the many gala cotillions New Orleans had boasted each spring. She thought with longing of the dress she would have worn, yards and yards of silk taffeta and lace and huge hoops. Her waist lace small enough for a fellow to put both hands around. Philip would have been standing beside her, tall and strong and proud, ready to lead her out for the first dance. But things hadn't been the way they should be for 6 years. Not since February 1861, when Louisiana seceded from the Union, one of the first 7 states to do so. Her brothers and their friends marched off to war, and most of them never came back. Her father and her 4 older brothers, dead in Mr. Lincoln's War. Her mother, dead in the occupation of New Orleans. Philip. The last news she had was 5 years old. Philip had written to tell them that Papa was wounded, a Union prisoner, and he was going with him to Rock Island to nurse him. A few months later, there'd been a letter from the prison commander's wife telling them Papa was dead, but they never learned what happened to Philip. He could have gone anywhere, even back to the army if he'd managed to cross the lines. All Jett knew for sure was that he'd never come home, but she refused to believe he was dead. They were twins. If anything happened to the one, the other always knew it. He had to be here in the West, where Tyrant Johnson's yoke lay lightly on the necks of exiled Southerners. She had to believe that. It was all that kept her keeping on. She didn't tie up Nightingale with the other horses. She looped his reins at the saddle horn as the stallion gazed scornfully down his aristocratic nose at the dusty cow ponies. She patted his shoulder, bidding a temporary farewell to a good friend, and stepped up onto the weathered wood sidewalk in front of the saloon. A feeling of weary familiarity descended on her as she stepped through the batwing doors and paused, stripping off her gloves as she let her eyes adjust to the gloom. Sawdust covered the floor, kerosene lamps, the only source of light, hung from wall brackets, and a chandelier made from a wagon wheel was suspended from the exposed rafters. This was the sort of place Jett Gallatin was all too familiar with by now. For years ago, I had no idea places like this even existed. There were almost a dozen men in the saloon, 11, to be precise, plus the barkeeper. At this time of day, the locals would be at their supper tables, so these were men without homes or steady employment. A trail boss riding shorthanded might pick up one of them to help out on a drive, but he knew he'd be taking his chances if he did. You had no way of knowing it a man was any good until you'd tried him, and halfway between South Texas and Abilene was a bad place to find out someone was an owl hoot. As Jett walked slowly up to the bar, the only sound in the saloon was the jingling of her silver spurs. The silence persisted as she put one foot up on the gleaming brass rail and leaned over the bar. I wonder if there's going to be trouble this time, she thought with resignation. She knew no one would guess she was a girl, but no matter how good her disguise, nothing she tried to make her look older stood up to close scrutiny. She looked like a boy, not a man, so she relied for protection on the flamboyant and menacing costume of a gunslinger. It was just lucky she was as good with a gun as her costume proclaimed she was. She'd had to be. "Where you from, stranger?" The bartender drew a beer without her asking and pushed it in front of her. "Up the trail," she replied. She fished out her money pouch and laid a silver dime on the counter. Union coin and Union tyranny, she thought with a reflexive sneer. Looking to see what's down the way. She picked up the beer and sipped it thirstily. At least the bitter stuff cut through the trail dust. "Been a few strangers through town lately," the bartender replied. She nodded. "Cattle drives come through here?" she asked, half turning away. She already knew they did. She used the conversation to cover the fact she was watching for trouble. Her next questions would be about finding a bed for the night and the prospects of signing up with a drive. Harmless, natural questions for a stranger to ask, and it wasn't impossible for a gambler to want to change his luck. If the bartender gave her the right answers, her next question would be, never mind. Without bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. A stranger in town was always fair game for the local bully. There wasn't a lot of law out here, and well, everything depended on how good you were with a gun, and with intimidation. Good with a gun, yes. Intimidation, not hardly. She'd just spotted Trouble sitting by himself at a table. He had half a bottle of whiskey in front of him, and he'd been eyeing her furtively from the moment she came in. Her rig-out caused as many problems as it stopped, mostly with fools who forgot a boy could be as deadly with a gun as any man. Now Mr. Trouble tried to lock eyes with her. She pulled her hat down a little lower over her eyes, meaningfully, but he didn't take the hint. The barkeep answered her question, though she'd already stopped listening, and when she didn't say anything more, he walked down to where he could keep an eye on his other customers and began to polish a glass with the hem of his dingy apron. As soon as the barkeep moved, Mr. Trouble heaved himself to his feet and wove tipsily toward her. He was fat and unshaven, wearing clothing that hadn't seen a washboard in far too long. She kept her expression bland, though she wanted to snarl in exasperation. Barring a miracle, Mr. Trouble was going to start something she'd have to finish, and then she'd have to light out ahead of whatever law this place had to offer. She really didn't want to have to draw down on him, or worse, shoot him. She'd been hoping to stay a few days and make some inquiries. Wonder if throwing my beer in his face will cool him down peaceable-like. She guessed she'd find out before she got much older. It took the drunken Ranahan a fair amount of time to make his unsteady way up to the bar, but there was no doubt in Jett's mind he was aching for trouble. Any chance their encounter was going to end peaceably was becoming smaller by the minute. At least she didn't have to worry about sun glare. It was full dark outside by now. So what's he going to say? She wondered, in the peace that always descended on her in the last moments before violence became inevitable. "You ain't from around here, is ya?" Or, "We don't cotton to strangers round here." Or, "Them's mighty big guns fair sec a little feller?" She eyed the other customers of the bar to see how they were going to react to the unequal fight. Was Mr. Trouble the town clown or a bully everyone feared? If he was a bully, she might be applauded for putting him down. If he wasn't, if he was someone everyone liked, even if they didn't respect him, she'd have to get out of this without seriously hurting him, or she'd have a posse on her heels. Her insides tightened up, and everything got a little sharper. Most of the bar's customers didn't even seem to notice that someone's misfortune, anyway, was brewing, and she couldn't read the faces of the rest. She glanced toward the barkeep, hoping for a better clue. But just as she took her eyes off Mr. Trouble, she heard Nightingale whining in warning. She took 3 long backward steps away from the bar, her hands going for her guns as her gaze turned toward the swinging doors. And then every horse outside the saloon, even Nightingale, screamed in fear. The batwing doors swung inward, and a wind as cold as the breeze from an icehouse, too cold for the season, poured into the bar. Even through the cold, Jett could smell a stink like a New Orleans cemetery at high summer. The bar's customers began to curse and complain, but before they could really get going, a horde of unholy things shambled in through the open doors. They were wearing everything from dirt-caked Sunday suits to the ragged tatters of denim overalls. They'd been people once. Now they were dead, half-rotted bodies with white-filmed, sightless eyes. Some bore the marks of bullet holes or knife wounds. Some had the grotesque stretched and broken necks of hanged men. Some had been gnawed by varmints. They were all carrying weapons, pickaxes, spades, pitchforks, and even clubs. Jett clutched her gun butts, though she wondered if the rosary she wore around her neck might be more use. There was a horrified silence in the saloon as its customers realized what had just come through the door. A thump as the barkeep dropped whatever had been holding, and then a boom as he whipped his shotgun up from under the bar and fired both barrels. It blew an arm off one of the creatures and knocked another to the ground. But the first didn't seem to notice the missing limb, and the second merely got up again with a fresh gaping crater in its chest. As if that had been a signal, every living man was on his feet and shooting into the mob of the undead. The saloon filled with the thunder and lightning of gunplay and the smell of gun smoke, but the barrage had no visible effect. The zombies kept coming, the stink of gunpowder mixed with the stench of rotting corpses. Some of the shooters reloaded to fire again, while some had flung aside their useless guns and were looking wildly for any other sort of weapon. The barkeep vanished behind the bar again and came back up with a fire axe. One of the brighter rannies got the notion to pick up a chair and smash it into the face of one of the things, and then all hell was out for noon. Jett heard a sickening crunch as a living man went down beneath a corpse's club. Jett still hadn't drawn her own weapons. Her retreat had placed her on the opposite side of the saloon from everyone else, but if she'd had any hopes the living could win this Donnybrook, they were dashed within seconds. More and more shambling corpses were shoving their way into the saloon, and while the door on the back wall probably led to the street, it was at the far end of the room, and she couldn't get to it. As she backed all the way down to the end of the bar, she saw one of the dead grab the axe from the barkeep's hands. His screams were mercifully brief. The locals were surrounded, outnumbered, and out of bullets. The situation was hopeless. For the moment, the zombies were concentrating on the men attacking them, and if she didn't want to make this place her last stand, Jett had one chance and seconds in which to take it. She took a deep breath and jammed her Stetson on tight, then made a running dive for the saloon window, ducking her head into her shoulder to save her face from the glass. She hit the window with a splintering crash of wooden glass and turned her dive into a somersault over the plank walk. She tumbled out into the street and rolled to her feet. The cow ponies had all fled. The hitching rail was empty, except for a few trailing pieces of broken reins. She couldn't see Nightingale anywhere. She heard screaming, and as she looked frantically around, she saw movement in the street. The street was full of the things, a dozen she could see, maybe more she couldn't. They hadn't just attacked the saloon. They'd attacked the whole town at once, and from the sound of things, nobody else was having better luck than the men in the saloon had. Worse, the shattering window had drawn the zombies' attention. She groaned in despair as she backed slowly away from the milling corpses. She would have made a run for the church, but they were between her and it. Maybe I can outrun them, she thought desperately. Cowboy boots weren't meant for walking, let alone running, but just now Jett was powerfully motivated. A flicker of light behind her caught her attention. She risked a glance toward it, and saw one of the storefronts was on fire. Broken lamp, she thought inanely. In the firelight, she could see figures heading for the street. From their shuffling gait, she knew what they were. She was surrounded now. Fear nailed her feet to the ground. As the undead moved closer, she crossed herself quickly, breathed a prayer, and thrust 2 fingers into her mouth and whistled shrilly. If she hadn't removed her gloves as she'd walked into the saloon, she would have died here. But she and Nightingale were much more than horse and rider. They were partners. And because of that, he didn't flee when ordinary horses bolted in panic, and he came to her rescue when even a human partner would have thought twice. Even so, he was almost too late. In the distance, she heard a stallion's wild scream of challenge. Nightingale was coming. All she had to do was stay alive until he got here. She gazed around herself wildly, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. She spotted a Winchester leaning against a wall. It would serve as a club if nothing else. But before she could dash across the street to get it, she saw more zombies coming out of the doorway beside it. There was nowhere she could run and nothing to fight with. They were going to kill her, and Nightingale would die trying to save her. And who would search for Philip once she was dead? Fear gave way to fury, igniting a fire in her that burned away everything else. "Come on, you useless blue bellies," she shouted. "Come on if you want to fight." The nearest zombie was only a few feet away now. She ran toward it and punched it as hard as she could, then yelped in disgust and jumped back as dead. Half-rotten flesh slid beneath her blow. Her punch had torn the corpse's face half off. It didn't stun the zombie, but it knocked it backward. It fell into the 2 directly behind it, and all 3 went down, but there were more than enough to take their places. One of them raised its arm and swung it at her as if the arm were a club. Its forearm caught her on the side of the head and knocked her sprawling. The corpses closed in. She struggled to her knees, only to be felled by another blow. They weren't fast or nimble, but they were impossibly strong, and nothing she did could hurt them. If any of them had possessed a weapon, a club, a stick, a length of wood, she wouldn't have survived the next few minutes. But the ones in the street were obviously the ones who hadn't had weapons, and the ones who'd come to join them had dropped or lost theirs. She scrabbled backward on heels and elbows, dragging out one of her Colts as she did. When the nearest zombie reached for her, she held the pistol out at arm's length and pulled the trigger. Her arm flew up with the recoil. A peacemaker had a kick like an angry mule. She'd seen what happened in the saloon. Bullets hadn't stopped them, but the impact knocked down whatever it hit. Her attacker spun away into the advancing mob. She tried to get to her feet, to keep moving, to run, but she was outnumbered. Dead flesh pummeled her. Dead fingers clawed at her face, her neck, her clothes. Soon one of them would hit her hard enough to snap her neck or knock her out. Soon the ones with weapons would arrive. Rescue arrived first. She didn't see Nightingale until he burst through the zombie mob and stood over her protectively. The stallion was covered with foam, his eyes white-rimmed in terror. But he'd come for her. She reached up, dazed by the blows she'd taken, to claw at the stirrup leather and use it to drag herself to her feet. She was almost knocked sprawling again when he reared to strike out at the nearest enemy, but she clung to him, clawing her way upward into the saddle, using her gun but to pull herself up because she was clutching it too tightly to let go, even if she'd wanted to. The moment he felt her weight settle, Nightingale bounded forward. She felt cold, dead hands grab her legs, her saddle, anything they could reach, and she battered at them with her gun, but until their hands were so ruined they could no longer grip. Then Nightingale was through them. She finally got her feet into the stirrups as he galloped blindly into the night. It took her both hands to get her pistol back into its holster. Only then did she let herself realize what had just happened. 10 miles outside Alsop, a stream the locals called Burnt Crick cut across the staked plain. In summer it was no more than a dry stream bed, but winter rains turned it into a broad torrent fast enough and deep enough to down unwary cattle, and in spring it filled most of its bed. Cottonwood trees lined both banks. Beneath their shelter sat a wagon. On the far side of the stream a young man stood beside his brown and white paint mare gazing across the creek, just as he had for the last hour. The 2 of them were concealed from view by the trees and scrub. The young man wore fringed buckskin breeches and moccasins, a cavalry hat without hat cords or creased crown, and a blue army coat. He'd arrived at Burnt Creek in late afternoon only to find his favorite camping spot already occupied. He had business in Allsup, but by the time he got there it would be dark, and he didn't want to try to find a bed in the town. He should have ridden on, but something about the wagon held his attention. It was a Burton wagon, the same kind the traveling drummers sold their snake oil tonics from, but instead of being brightly painted, it bore a sober coat of whitewash. That wasn't enough to draw his scrutiny, but the fact there was no wagon tongue to hitch the horses to was. In fact, there were no horses in sight to hitch to the wagon, even if there'd been a way to do it. The Burtons' only occupant seemed to be a young blonde female in an outlandish costume. Loose blue serge trousers gathered at the ankle, a short dress of the same stuff, and a poke bonnet hanging down her back by its ribbons. If he needed any further proof beyond her costume to tell him the girl was from somewhere far away, the poke provided it. No woman in the territory, from sodbuster to rancher, would uncover her head while the sun was above the horizon. If her team had run off before he got there, it didn't seem to worry her. He'd watched as she lit her fire, and she seemed to be perfectly comfortable out here all by herself. The tin coffee pot she set out was commonplace enough, as were the iron griddle and cookpot. The one held flatbread and the other held beans. Soon enough the aroma of coffee and beans drifted across the stream, and she was piecing out flatbread to bake on the griddle. But despite her obvious competence, his concern only grew. The only thing she had to defend herself with was a Remington Coach gun, and even though it was within easy reach, there were plenty of dangers out here for a man, never mind a lone female. The sun was already on the horizon. You should ride on if you want to make camp while there's light left, he told himself, but somehow he couldn't make himself mount up and head out. You surely don't mean to leave her all alone out here, he scolded himself. Perhaps she doesn't know there's a town so near. He could go and tell her. He could bring her with him to Allsup. Deerfoot could carry double, and take his chances there. She could rent a buckboard from the livery stable, and tomorrow Sheriff Mitchell could ride back here with her and help her look for her missing horses. It seemed like the best plan. He lifted himself onto Deerfoot's back and sent her toward the stream with a nudge of his knee. Honoria Providentia Gibbons looked up at the sound of splashing and reached for her firearm. A handsome pinto mare was crossing the stream. Gibbons wasn't a very good shot, but that was why she carried a Coach gun. With a Coach gun, you didn't have to be good. You only had to be willing to pull the trigger. At first Gibbons didn't think the mare wore either saddle or bridle, but then she realized she was tacked out Indian style, with a blanket for a saddle and only a single braided leather cord for a bridle. Most observers would see the horse, the rider's darkly tanned skin, and think, Indian. But the rider was no native. Even from here Gibbons could see his hair was wavy and a few shades lighter than his skin. Well, that's interesting. I wonder if he's an army scout? She watched the horse and rider approach with curiosity tempered with wariness. Hello, the camp, the man called when his mount reached the bank. Hello, stranger, she replied, setting down her gun and waving to him to approach. Welcome. I have coffee. She broke off to rescue the flatbread before it scorched, wrapping her hand in the end of her rather bedraggled shawl to pull the griddle away from the fire. And bread and beans, she finished rather breathlessly. You're welcome to share them. That's kind of you, ma'am, he replied. He signaled to his mare to halt and slid easily off her back. She followed him as a dog would as he walked toward the campfire. No matter his appearance, he has lived some time among the natives, Gibbons thought. No one accustomed to wearing boots walks toe-heel instead of heel-toe, in boots or out of them. Honoria Gibbons, she said, extending her hand. But you must call me Gibbons, as my friends do. Pleased to make your acquaintance, mister. She paused expectantly. Wapeshk Wakosh, he replied, shaking her hand gingerly. But I think it will be simpler if you call me White Fox. She narrowed her eyes a bit in concentration. To her pleasure, she recognized the language, group Algonquin, and his pronunciation gave her the dialect. Your accent is Meshkwakahaki, I think, she said. But you are far from home for a red earth man, Mr. Fox, she added, for the westernmost of the Sac and Fox tribes lived in the new state of Nebraska. She smiled when she saw his pupils dilate a little. It was the only sign of his surprise. Raised among them from childhood, I think, and not some frontiersman who has merely lived as their guest. Most people would miss the subtle clues she'd noticed, but Honoria Gibbons took no small amount of pride in the fact she was not most people. White Fox was startled. The Wasatches said there were no spirits, but either this girl spoke to spirits, or she saw as truly as one of the Red Earth people. But even if she was more than she seemed, she was still alone out here. "Perhaps you do not know there is a town up the road," he said, politely averting his eyes from her face. "It is no more than 10 miles from here. I was headed that way myself, and I would be glad to take you there. Tomorrow you can return to search for your horses. They will not wander far from water." She said nothing, and he hesitated, not wishing to frighten her. "Not everyone in the Llano Estacado is friendly," he finally said. "You'd be more comfortable in town. And safer." Honoria Gibbons smiled as if he'd said something amusing. "Oh, I think anyone who attempted to interfere with me would discover it to be a very bad idea." Her left foot moved a little as she spoke, and he froze as a slat dropped down on the side of the wagon. The muzzles of 3 deadly Gatling guns extended from the slot and pivoted to his position, though he was certain her wagon was unoccupied. Perhaps she wasn't as helpless as she appeared, he decided. There came the same scraping sound of wood on wood he'd heard a moment before. The muzzles retracted, and the slat popped back up into place. "Yes," she said. "A very bad idea indeed." "I reckon you know your own mind, ma'am," White Fox replied calmly. "Would you mind if I stayed tonight and shared your fire?" "Not at all," Gibbons replied cheerfully. "Coffee." He turned to Deerfoot, whisking the saddle blanket free and slipping the loop of her bridle from her lower jaw so she could graze freely. The mare wandered off to the river, and he coiled the rein between his hands, the blanket tossed over one shoulder as he squatted down beside the fire and poured himself a cup of coffee. "I should be quite glad of the company," actually, Gibbons continued. "You seem like a gentleman who can make intelligent conversation." As she regarded him with utter fearlessness, White Fox realized this eccentric and possibly mad female might be the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. From her flawless skin and golden hair to the dark eyes blue, he thought, alight with a fierce intelligence. And he sensed she was utterly unaware of her beauty. "Beans, Mr. Fox?" Gibbons asked brightly. "If you were to go in search of my horses, Mr. Fox, I am afraid you would search in vain," Gibbons said, handing him a plate of beans and flatbread. The night had fallen swiftly, and she'd lit the kerosene lanterns on the near side of the wagon before settling to her own meal. White Fox looked politely puzzled, but Gibbons knew enough about the Red Earth people to know he wouldn't do anything as rude as ask a near stranger a direct question. "This is an auto-tacopode," she said grandly, gesturing at the wagon. "Papa and I built it together. It does not require horses to provide its motive power." "I do not see how that is possible," White Fox said doubtfully. Gibbons laughed gaily. "I shall give you a demonstration in the morning, Mr. Fox. Then you will see." "Perhaps I shall," White Fox agreed. Gibbons stifled a grin and applied herself to her meal. She paid little attention to the taste. Food, after all, was merely fuel for the brain, and unimportant except in that bad food was difficult to choke down. But White Fox devoured her cooking with relish, and even asked for seconds. When supper was over, he indicated his tobacco pouch and looked at her inquiringly. She nodded her permission, and he busied himself rolling a cigarette. She was grateful they were outdoors. While she wouldn't dream of dictating someone else's behavior, nicotine was a drug, and a pernicious one at that, and Honoria Gibbons did not ingest any mind-altering substances such as tobacco, alcohol, or opium. She prized clear thought far too much. And besides, tobacco smoke stank. By the time he'd gotten his cigarette made and lit and taken his first draw, he'd obviously decided their acquaintance had progressed enough that he might ask her some questions. "You say you built this device with your father," he observed, nodding toward the auto-tacopode. "Will he be joining you soon?" Gibbons shook her head, pouring herself another cup of coffee. Coffee, after all, stimulated mental alertness. "I travel alone, Mr. Fox." White Fox shook his head. "This seems unwise to me. You are certainly quite clever, but against wild beasts or outlaws, cleverness might not be enough." Gibbons stifled a tiny sigh of exasperation at hearing the familiar sentiment. In her experience, there was no obstacle that did not fall before the power of the mind. Far be it from her to point out yet again that the majority of the lady pioneers here in the West spent the greater part of their lives either alone while their husbands were out hunting or trapping or tilling the soil, or performing those tasks themselves when one of the perils White Fox had listed carried that husband off. Both men and women had lectured Gibbons on the unsuitability of her chosen vocation, and when she marshaled her arguments, said, "But that's different." How it was different, no one was ever quite able to explain to her satisfaction. "I am afraid I cannot share your opinion, Mr. Fox," Gibbons said tactfully, wiping her tin plate clean with the last of her bread and setting it aside. "And Papa needs a certain amount of protection from himself," she added carefully. "America is full of charlatans, and he is forever hearing from people who want him to invest in all manner of idiotic schemes. That is why I am here." This was oversimplifying things to the extreme, for to say Jacob Saltonstall Gibbons was a genius was rather like saying Leonardo da Vinci had been a passable painter, and with such genius came a certain amount of eccentricity. Those eccentricities had moved the wealthy Gibbons family to provide their youngest son with all the money he wanted so long as he stayed far, far away from Boston. But soon their remuneration had been overtaken by events. The gold fever of 1849 had drawn her then, widowed parent and his infant daughter westward. For Jacob Gibbons had eagerly sought the opportunity to test some theories he'd formed regarding mining equipment, and very much to his surprise, he'd gained a more than respectable fortune from his engineering parents. But his newfound wealth brought problems of its own. In San Francisco, his dear friend Dr. Rupert Arthur Gordon kept him from being taken by charlatans. But soon the con men began to cast their nets from afar. "Idiotic schemes?" White Fox asked. "As many as there are leaves on this cottonwood tree," Gibbons said, sighing. "Finding the lost city of Atlantis, creating the Philosopher's Stone, building a mediumistic telegraph to communicate with the dead. I was just in Kansas City, exposing a gentleman who claimed to be able to summon twisters, at will." She snorted inelegantly. "I assure you, such was not the case. I soon discovered he had confederates further west, who would telegraph to him when the right sorts of storms were on the way. The charlatans' spotters had possessed clever rigs they could use to tap into telegraph lines wherever they could shinny up a pole. What had gotten him slapped into jail was not the fraud, for her father was to have been the first paying victim, but the purloining of the messaging service without paying for it. And before that, I was in the Arizona Territory, looking for some bizarre creature called a chupacabra. Its would-be captor had sent photographs of it to Papa, wishing to be compensated for the expense of tracking the beast down and shipping it to San Francisco. The photographs were faked, of course, and though the Mexican farmers assured me the creature truly existed, their chupacabra turned out to be merely a wild boar. "I have heard of the chupacabra," White Fox said doubtfully. "I have never seen one, nor did the tracks shown to me belong to anything but beasts I already knew well. So you see," she shrugged, "it is my job, self-appointed though it may be, to track such villains down, uncover them as frauds, and send Papa the proof. At least sending me keeps Papa from sending money instead. And I confess, I do enjoy this far more than I would going to operas and plays and other such nonsense." "And what are you pursuing now?" White Fox asked boldly. Apparently he'd forgotten she was a female, in his interest in her tales, momentarily at least. "Mysterious disappearances," she told him. "Papa believes great phantom airships sail the skies, contraptions like aerial clipper ships. The crews of the phantom airships are said to have abducted individuals and even entire communities. And of course there is a man who swears he can put Papa into communication with the captain of one such airship for a modest fee." She shrugged. "It is true there have been many unexplained disappearances here of late, but I have yet to see a sign of anything even remotely like a clipper ship in the sky." "Nor have I," White Fox answered. He tried to keep his tone light, but Gibbons realized his interest had sharpened the moment she'd begun to speak of disappearances. "And you do not believe in these airships?" he asked. "I am keeping my mind open to the possibility," she admitted. "After all, Papa and I built this," she patted the side of her wagon fondly. "So others might have built airships. But I am a scientist and a skeptic. All I know for certain is there have been enough unexplained disappearances of late to engender stories in the newspapers. Most of them came from this area." Now White Fox looked genuinely startled. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and then closed it again. His cigarette had burned down nearly to his fingers. He flicked the end absently into the fire and continued to regard her closely. "Do you have some intelligence touching on these disappearances, Mr. Fox?" she asked bluntly, hoping he might be able to put her on the right track. He regarded her for a very long moment indeed, and Gibbons began to believe she might have misjudged his character. Finally, though grudgingly, he nodded. I, too, seek an answer to a disappearance, he admitted. My investigation is the fulfillment of a pledge, in a manner of speaking. Was this disappearance recent? She demanded eagerly. Can you tell me more? There was, until a few months ago, a town of freedmen in Kansas called Glory Rest, he said reluctantly. I do not imagine you would think its disappearance important, or even worth investigation. She sat up indignantly. Mr. Fox, pray give me some credit for human feelings. These missing a whole town were as much human beings as you and I. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, living in freedom for the first time. Tell me the details, everything you know is relevant. He blinked at her fervor. If I am to do that, I must begin at the beginning. I am a scout for the 10th Cavalry out of Fort Riley, Kansas. Ah, she said in satisfaction at the confirmation of her earlier hunch. Buffalo soldiers, brave men, and true, I have read a very great deal about them. He blinked in surprise. Then you already know of the Negro soldier units, she waved her hand dismissively. Of course. Pray go on. I am not myself a soldier, but a civilian contractor to the Army. One of the soldiers of the 10th, Caleb Lincoln, asked me to go to Glory Rest to discover why his mother's letters had ceased to arrive, and his captain gave me leave to do so. Glory Rest is perhaps 100 miles from Fort Riley. It is a small town. Its inhabitants strove to make their living by farming the land. When I reached it, the town was completely deserted. Gibbons chewed her lower lip a moment as she mentally reviewed what she knew of that region. Not an attack by the Apache or the Cheyenne? She asked carefully. Both tribes raided and destroyed settlements when they could. It was understandable. Their land and their freedom were being destroyed by Anglo settlement. But it was also lamentable. Innocent people bore the punishment for the federal policy that the first inhabitants of this land had no claim upon it. White Fox shook his head. The settlement was in great disarray, it is true, but I saw nothing I could not consider the work of storms or scavengers. There were a few small fires obviously caused by untended oil lamps, but I saw none of the signs that would tell me Glory Rest had been attacked by a raiding party. But every person who once lived there was gone. And of course, since it was a freedman settlement, no one had reported it, nor would it be mentioned in a newspaper. She tried not to sound too disapproving, but facts were facts, and it was better to stare them in the face. He nodded. Rather than return to the fort with a greater mystery, I chose to seek answers. Roughly a week ago, I was in San Antonio and heard that an entire cattle drive, riders and cattle both had vanished. I am on the back trail of that drive now. Gibbons felt the little tingle of excitement that marked a moment when she had hit a true trail. Although a few moments ago she would have waved cheerfully to White Fox's departing back come morning. From this moment on he would have a difficult time shaking her loose from his heels. And have you found anything yet? She asked. He shook his head again, clearly frustrated. Nothing. The drovers and the cattle simply vanished, as if your phantom airship truly exists, Gibbons. As if the earth swallowed them, or they walked into another world. I have only this, in the last letter Trooper Lincoln had from his mother. Suddenly he broke off, turning to stare intently into the darkness. A moment later, Gibbons heard what had summoned his attention. The sound of a horse galloping toward them, as no horse should gallop on so uncertain a road in the dark, unless the case was dire indeed. They both jumped to their feet. White Fox laid a hand on his pistol, and Gibbons snatched up the coach gun. Either the rider was an outlaw being hotly pursued, or an innocent being pursued by outlaws. And in either case, I want to get off the first shot, not the second, Gibbons thought.